They say history is written by the victors. But what of the women who were never meant to win, only to endure, or to vanish without a name? What of those who danced not in triumph, but in velvet-draped silence, their deeds scrubbed from cathedral walls and court records alike? Tonight, I shall take you beyond the pages of sanctioned history, into the vaulted halls of a forgotten cult. A sisterhood of noble women cloaked in lace and crimson, who believed that beauty, power, and eternal youth could be conjured with the blood of the nameless. We begin not in the grandeur of Versailles or Vienna, but in the moss-draped hinterlands of Moravia, in the dead of winter. In the year of our Lord 1623, a time when Europe bled from 100 wars, and the skies above Central Europe hung low with plague smoke and cannon ash. It was here, in a half-ruined estate called Vesca-Nod, that an anonymous letter reached the desk of Bishop Jan, a man whose name history remembers, but only faintly. The letter bore no seal, only a smear of wax blackened by ash, and its words were inked in what appeared to be rust. It read, "In the high manor, upon the broken hill, beneath the wailing statue, they bathe at midnight. The girls go in, but they do not return. You must come. They feed not on bread nor wine. They drink of the innocent." The bishop dismissed it at first as peasant madness, until 3 more letters arrived, each naming the same place, the same rituals, the same cries in the snow. The estate in question belonged to Countess Eliska von Harrow, a name nearly wiped from every register, but once feared from Bohemia to the Baltic. She was the last of a dying bloodline, a widow twice over by the age of 26, with no heir, no siblings, and a reputation as pale and hard as the marble busts that lined her garden. But the Countess was not alone. She presided over a circle of women, widows, barren wives, and banished daughters, all of noble blood, all childless, and all bound by a secret so grotesque that even the Church hesitated to speak it aloud. They were called the Crimson Veil by those who dared whisper, though among themselves they used no name, only silence and ritual. "It is," said the cult began, after the great frost of 1608, when half of Moravia starved, and the other half buried its children beneath the frozen dirt. The aristocracy fled the cities, retreating to their distant estates, where the rules of man and God grew thin. In this vacuum, whispers flourished, of ancient rites brought from the East, of Persian elixirs made from youth, of the Roman Empress Messalina, who slept on beds soaked in virgin blood. The women of the Crimson Veil did not invent the hunger, they inherited it. By the spring of 1624, 8 young girls had disappeared from the villages flanking Vesca-Nod. Orphans all, each one vanished on a moonless night. The last sighting of them, often near the estate's frost-bitten orchard, where hounds were said to patrol with eyes like fire. But no charges were brought. For who accuses a countess? Who dares to climb the hill where the snow never melts, where lanterns glow red through shuttered windows, and the air itself smells faintly of iron? What few knew then, and fewer know now, is that Bishop Jan did investigate, quietly, and without blessing from the Vatican. He disguised himself as a physician and rode north in secrecy. His journals, hidden in a lead-bound case, discovered centuries later beneath a Jesuit priory, speak of what he saw. He arrived at Vesca-Nod under the guise of treating a sick chambermaid. The Countess greeted him at dusk. She wore a mourning gown, though no one had died that season, and her voice was calm, as though reciting from memory rather than speaking. The manor was cold, but not for lack of fire. Candles burned in every hall, but their flames were low, and the air heavy. A scent lingered, like roses drowned in copper. In his first night, the bishop observed little, but the second night, he heard it, a sound distant and strange, neither scream nor song, but something in between, a wailing, high and wet, echoing from beneath the chapel's floor. The countess's chapel, rarely used, its altar stained and unused by any priest in 20 years. He crept from his quarters, descending through servant corridors, until he found a concealed stair behind the chapel's confession box. It spiraled downward, deeper than any cellar had reason to go. There, beneath the estate, he found them. A room lit by blood-colored lanterns, an altar not of wood but bone, a basin of polished obsidian, large enough for a woman to lie in, and within it, dark liquid, still warm. Around it stood 5 women, cloaked and veiled. They murmured in a language he did not know, one that made his bones hum and his nose bleed. At their center stood Eliska. She was naked but for a veil of white lace. Her body bore strange markings, brands, perhaps, in symbols not of any Christian origin. Her eyes were open, unblinking, and her hands dripped red. The girl in the basin did not move. The bishop fled. He returned to Prague within the week, never speaking of what he saw to the clergy. Only in his journals did he record it, pages that would vanish for centuries until recovered by accident during the Nazi occupation, buried behind a false wall. But this is not the story of one bishop and one cult. This is the story of what came next. Because once the crimson veil had tasted power, once they had soaked their skin in the life of another, they did not stop. They multiplied, they spread, and for nearly 70 years the courts of Europe whispered of women who did not age, who did not bear children, who slept in daylight and danced beneath moonlight, women who offered sanctuary to the lost. You may think this is the stuff of folklore, of myths spun to scare children. But why then do so many noble family trees end abruptly in the 17th century? Why do so many paintings from that era show women with skin to smooth, eyes to wide, faces nearly doll-like? Why, in the archives of 5 different monasteries, are there references to the 13 who bathed in scarlet? We continue now to the second woman, the Mirror Maiden of. She was called the Mirror Maiden, not because of her beauty, though she was beautiful in the manner of glass, clear, cold, and fragile only to those who dared touch her. No, they called her that because she never passed a mirror without stopping, never left a room without first staring into her reflection, as though her soul lived on the other side and might escape if she didn't keep it tethered. Her name was Katarzyna Zawisza, the daughter of a disgraced Polish voivode who vanished in the Baltic Wars, leaving her a vast, crumbling manor outside and a fortune that smelled of old coins and forgotten violence. She was 20 when the snows came and stayed, 21 when her first maid disappeared, and 22 when she stopped aging altogether. The court whispered she had made a pact with the devil, that she brushed her hair with ivory combs dipped in infant marrow, that her laughter could curdle milk and turn the bells of St. Mary's black. But the truth, if truth it was, came not from escorts but from a monk named Brother Jacob, who chronicled Katarzyna's fall in a hidden folio of the monastery at Nepowamus. A man who claimed to have loved her before he took the cloth, a man who watched her transform. He wrote of a visit, a single carriage in the dead of winter. It arrived without notice and bore no heraldry only a silver emblem of a weeping eye. From it emerged a woman cloaked in gray, her face obscured, her hands gloved despite the cold. She brought Katarzyna a gift, a mirror. But this was no ordinary mirror. It bore no reflection unless one stood before it with blood upon their skin. Katarzyna W. the lady stayed only one night, and in the morning her carriage was gone. But Katarzyna's servants said their mistress changed after that. She wandered the halls at night, whispered to herself in languages no one recognized. Birds died in their cages, the orchard withered, and the children from the nearby village began to vanish. The bodies were never found, but once a month, always on the new moon, a pale red mist would descend over the manor, and the dogs in the valley would howl in unison, their cries sounding like morning hymns. Brother Jacob, still young then, was summoned to bless the estate after the fourth disappearance. The villagers demanded it, and Katarzyna, ever the lady, obliged. He found her thinner than he remembered, her skin like porcelain left too long in moonlight. She spoke sweetly, but her eyes, they were empty, not lifeless, hollow, like something else looked out from behind them. He described the inside of her manor as a mausoleum of mirrors, dozens of them, tall as men and framed in blackened silver, covered every wall, every corridor, every stairwell, but none reflected him, only her. He asked her why, and she smiled. Because they know whose soul they belong to, she whispered. That night he could not sleep. The manor creaked and wept with every gust of wind. Sometime after midnight he rose and wandered, and found the Hall of Crimson. It was a chamber sealed behind a mirror, a false one, which slid aside with the faintest touch, revealing a staircase slick with condensation. The air beneath reeked of rot and lavender. There, in the chamber below, Katarzyna stood before a great basin. At its center lay a child, no older than 7, unconscious, barely breathing. The mirror maiden bathed her face with the child's blood, scooping it in her bare hands, smearing it across her cheeks like rouge. She whispered not prayers, but promises, names, and something darker, a chant that made the walls ripple and Brother Jacob retch bile into his own hands. She turned then and saw him, but she did not scream, she only smiled. You always loved me, she said, voice calm, now you can love me forever. He ran, but not fast enough. He awoke days later in the monastery infirmary, his body scarred, his eyes bruised, but his memory intact. He wrote everything, feverishly, in a codex of deer hide and pig's blood ink, binding it with iron and sealing it beneath the chapel stones. He ended his account with one final note. She has not aged, not once. The mirror feeds her, the child's blood binds her, and I see her now, sometimes outside the abbey walls, always in a gray cloak, always watching. The mirror maiden of was never tried, never even questioned. Her estate burned in 1662, though no fire was recorded. No survivors emerged, and yet travelers say that in certain windows of the hill above the Vistula, one can still see a reflection, even when no one stands there. And so it was that Eliska was not alone. Katarzyna joined her in silence, bound by rituals older than Christ, and blood older than any baptism. But how did such horrors remain hidden? How did a cult of noblewomen, bathed in scarlet and shadow, thrive in the most scrutinized courts of Europe? For that, we must turn west to France, to the silk salons of Versailles, and to a woman named Marguerite du Villette, the Duchess of Glass. She arrived at the court of Louis XIV with neither invitation nor pedigree. No one knew from where she came. No one remembered her name the year before. And yet, within a single season, she held the king's ear, the queen's gaze, and every chamberlain's dread. She called herself Marguerite de Villette, though no such lineage existed in any archive of Normandy or Champagne. Her voice was silken, her movements liquid, not graceful, but deliberate, like a spider descending from its thread. Her skin was without blemish, her eyes the color of overcast glass. She claimed widowhood, though no one ever saw a mourning band, and she wore gloves, always, even in summer. Versailles, of course, was a nest of vipers long before she arrived. Perfumed intrigue oozed through its golden halls, and scandal fluttered like moths around every candlelit supper. But even here, Marguerite was something else. She never laughed, never wept, and never slept. According to her handmaids, who vanished by autumn and was replaced by a mute girl from Brittany, no more than 10. It was the winter of 1675 when rumors began to bloom, quiet and poisonous, like mold behind a silk tapestry. A physician's apprentice claimed he saw a trail of blood leading from Marguerite's apartments. A laundress whispered of bedsheets stained rust-brown, discarded in the Seine. A palace guard was said to have opened the wrong door during midnight patrol and never returned, though his boots were found filled with ash. Most dismissed such tales as court hysteria, but one man did not. His name was Claude Bellaname, royal cartographer, amateur historian, and a skeptic by profession. He believed in maps, not mysteries. But even he could not ignore the patterns. For in just 2 years, 15 girls disappeared within Versailles orbit pages. Kitchen girls, orphans from the Hotel des Enfants, none older than 14, all last seen near the wing Marguerite now called home. Claude, obsessive by nature, began to investigate. Quietly, patiently, he gathered names, traced servant rosters, matched dates of disappearance to the Duchess's private secret midnight salons known only to women of noble birth, where no men were permitted and no candles were used, only red lanterns, only wine the color of congealed blood. He obtained an invitation through a favor ode and a forged lineage. On the night of the masquerade, he entered the Duchess's wing disguised as a foreign countess, clad in mourning veils and silence. What he saw, he recorded in a journal never meant for public eyes. The room was round, mirrorless. The air smelled of orchids and old rot. 12 women stood in a circle, each veiled. In the center, a girl no older than 8 lay upon a marble slab shaped like a cradle. She did not move. Her hair was damp, as though she had wept through the skin. Marguerite spoke in a tongue I did not recognize, rhythmic, low, like breath drawn from an open wound. Then they began. One by one, the women dipped their gloved hands into bowls set at their feet. Red bowls, still warm. They marked their faces, their necks, their hearts. They whispered to the girl, or to something inside her. I tried to leave, but I was not alone. The girl opened her eyes. They were black, not dark, black, bottomless. And Marguerite turned to me and said, "The mapmaker draws his last line tonight." Claude ran, or tried to. He never made it past the outer gates. His body was found days later in the garden of the orangery, hands burned to bone, lips sewn shut with golden thread. His journal survived only by accident, hidden behind the wood panel of his writing desk, discovered decades later by a painter who inherited the estate. It remains locked in the National to this day, restricted under Section Noire. Marguerite d'Auvalette, meanwhile, flourished. She rose higher than any woman of unknown birth had ever risen. The king gifted her a suite near the Hall of Mirrors. The queen, barren and aching, asked her advice on fertility. And when the orphanage in Paris burned, killing 22 children in their sleep, Marguerite donated heavily to rebuild it. She left no heirs. She casts no shadow in oil or canvas. No portrait survives. But they say that at twilight, if you stand in the Queen's gallery and look into the tall mirror by the fireplace, you might glimpse her passing behind you, gloved, veiled, and watching. She was not the first, nor would she be the last, for the crimson veil, as they were later known by those few who dared study them, had no center, no capital, no cathedral. They existed wherever silence grew thick enough to hide screams, wherever power went unquestioned, wherever a child could be forgotten. But even the cult had rules, sacred rites, taboos, and one woman dared to break them. She was known as the Hollow Saint of Naples, and she was never meant to live. She was born during a lunar eclipse in the year 1681, beneath the crumbling arches of a plague-ravaged convent outside Naples. Her mother died before sunrise. No one ever claimed the body. No priest christened her. No name was recorded. The nuns called her La Vuta, the Hollow One, for she neither cried nor suckled, only stared with wide, waxy eyes that reflected candlelight, but seemed to absorb warmth. They say her breath frosted in summer, that she did not sleep, that she grew without ever learning to speak, and yet, somehow, all the sisters understood her. By the age of 9, 4 nuns had died in the night with dried blood crusting their lips. By 10, she had vanished from the convent, and the chapel doors were nailed shut by papal order. An edict was passed forbidding mass on that soil. No one buried the bodies. No one dared. The next record of her comes 15 years later, in the palazzo of Duchess Antonella Ferrati, a Venetian exile turned Neapolitan mystic, who kept a private court of women known as La Sorelle del Silenzio. They wore no color but ivory. They spoke only in whispers, and they had no mirrors in their house. The girl, now grown, was presented at court not as a servant or companion, but as a holy vision. The Duchess called her La Santa Vuta, the Hollow Saint, and once a week, high-born women knelt before her in veils and offered tokens: a braid of hair, a drop of blood, a letter never to be read. In exchange, she would place her fingers upon their forehead, and they would fall into trance. Upon waking, they wept, every single one. But that was not what terrified the city. What terrified Naples were the orphans, for with each passing month, more children vanished from the streets near the Duchess's estate. Beggars, cripples, lost girls from the port, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in dozens, always gone by morning, without a trace but for a single red ribbon tied to a lamppost, as if marking their place in absence. The priests tried to speak of it, but their tongues swelled. The guards refused to investigate. Those who did were found floating face down in the harbor, mouths filled with salt and lilies, and inside the palazzo, the Hollow Saint grew younger. She was now 26, but looked no older than 14. Her skin glowed like candle wax held against snow. Her lips were always pale, except during the rites, when they blushed crimson as if freshly kissed by blood. One chambermaid, the daughter of a nobleman's cook, survived long enough to escape. She stumbled into the Cathedral of San Gennaro during Easter Mass, barefoot and raving, eyes rolling in terror. She spoke of a chamber beneath the palazzo, a room where the walls pulsed, where the hollow saint lay floating in a basin shaped like a womb, veined with gold and black marble. Around her stood women in veils of lace, humming a lullaby older than Latin, and the children were beneath her. Their blood was not poured, it was drawn, pulsed through silver filaments, winding like veins into the basin's edge, dripped into the saint's mouth, not violently, not grotesquely, but slowly, like rain through leaves, like communion for something that no longer remembered what it meant to be human. The maid died 2 days later. Her body was intact, but her blood gone, every vein dry as ash. And so the Vatican sent a man, a Jesuit, Father Roberto della Cava, scholar, inquisitor, exorcist. He arrived in Naples under the guise of plague inspection, bringing with him only a wooden cross, a sealed writ from the Pope, and a page torn from the Gospel of Luke. He stayed 2 nights in the palazzo. He was never seen again, but a letter, half burned, never posted, was later discovered, sewn into the lining of his coat, preserved by time and wax. It read, "I have seen the girl. She is no longer a girl. Her eyes are 2 tombs. Her breath carries the smell of myrrh and milk. She speaks without moving her lips, and her voice calls me by name, a name I have not heard since childhood. This is no demon, no woman. This is hunger incarnate, a womb emptied and made sacred by suffering. I believe she is the key, not the beginning, but the center. And she must never awaken fully. If she does, the rest is ash." The hollow saint was never destroyed. The palazzo still stands, though few will walk beneath its shadows. It is said that on the anniversary of her birth, always during an eclipse, a pale light glows from the highest window, and the air grows still, as if waiting for breath to return. But the cult had changed. Where once they whispered in cellars and ruins, now they gathered in halls of silk and glass. Where once they needed secrecy, now they wore masks of charity, adoption, philanthropy, homes for wayward girls, relief for the war-born. They learned to hide in daylight. And among them rose a woman who would take the rituals further than any before her. She needed no mirror, no prayer, no saint, only fire, and her name was Isolde of the Burning Veil. She came from the north, not by carriage or name, but by legend. Her name, if it was hers at all, was Isolde. She bore no title, no land, no lineage, only a veil, black as cinders, threaded with ash and silk, that she never removed. To those who asked where she hailed from, she would smile and say, "From where the fires do not go out." It was the year 1704 when she appeared in Vienna, a city gilded with opera, drenched in perfume and powdered artifice, yet quaking beneath its Baroque splendor from the aftershocks of war. Orphans filled the streets like fallen leaves. Bastards of soldiers and famine-widowed girls sold ribbons for bread. The emperor's court, bloated with ceremony, turned its head until the children began to disappear, not from the gutters, but from charity houses, from sanctuaries, and from fire. The first blaze consumed the house of the Mourning Doves, a convent orphanage funded by royal endowment. It burned without warning, without survivors, and without noise. Witnesses swore the flames made no sound, no scream, only a soft, sucking roar, like breath drawn deep into a lung. Isolde arrived the next day. She offered aid, donations, a new estate for the surviving sisters. Though there were none, she became the patron of 3 more orphan houses in the following year. all of them burned, one by one, always without a single witness, always without resistance. And yet no one could touch her, no charges stuck, no inquiry survived the first hearing. Records turned to dust in their ledgers, names disappeared from rolls. Priests who condemned her were struck dumb in their pulpits. One was found blind at the foot of his altar, his eyes charred from the inside. Another vanished mid-sermon, leaving behind only a circle of soot and the faint smell of hair. You see, Isolde did not hide. She held salons, published poetry, works obsessed with purity and heat. She was painted, sketched, adored, her face always veiled, her gloved hands always warm, and her companions, always young girls, brought in from the frost, dressed in white, and never seen more than once. A woman named Greta Albrecht, a midwife turned writer, grew suspicious. She had lost her niece, an orphan once taken into Isolde's care. No body was found, no grave marked, only silence. Greta began to follow, to watch, to write. Her final diary, found decades later beneath the floorboards of her cottage, sealed with wax and rosemary, records her descent into the heart of Isolde's private estate in the forests beyond Vienna. The gate is iron, twisted into shapes of lilies and tongues. The house itself, black marble, taller than it should be. No smoke, yet always warm. The air hums. There are no birds. Inside, I see them. The girls, pale, quiet, some no older than 4, dressed like dolls, moving as if in sleep. I call out, no answer. A chamber door opens, and I smell it. Not rot, not death, but burnt milk, burnt hair, ash. I follow, down into the earth. There are no stairs, only a slope, carved, smooth as glass. The walls pulse. They are warm. There are candles, or something like candles, but they bleed. At the center, a hall, circular, the walls flame, not burning, just open, like a wound that glows. In the middle stands Isolde, veil gone. Her hair is white, not from age, but from heat. Her skin, cracked like old porcelain, and her eyes, they are twin furnaces. She is chanting. The girls lie around her in rings. Some are breathing, some are not. She pours something from her hand. It glows, it sizzles on the floor, and runs uphill. She looks at me, smiles, and says, "Purity is not the absence of filth, it is the presence of fire." I try to scream. I cannot. My breath is gone. My voice is ash. Greta's body was never found, but her writings remain, now catalogued in the forbidden archive of the Sterikische Nationalbibliothek under speculum mortis. And still Isolde moved untouched, for the cult by now no longer mere legend had evolved. They no longer whispered, they wrote, they sponsored hospitals, they funded orphanages, they preached purity and restoration, and walked among queens and cardinals. But Isolde remained different. Her rites were not for vanity, nor for youth. They were for heat, for pain, for cleansing. The other sisters began to fear her, and one, a French countess, tried to denounce her. She disappeared. Only once did Isolde speak in public. A gathering of noblewomen in Prague. A salon called La Chambre des Roses. She rose, veil lifted, eyes like hot coals, and said, "We are not witches. Witches steal power. We return it. We do not worship the devil. The devil is but a fool who mistakes his hunger for authority. We worship the wound from which all life bleeds, the wound which never closes. No one clapped, no one stood, but no one left either, and the fires kept burning. It is said that her veil still exists, preserved in a vault beneath Salzburg. If you touch it, your fingers blister. If you hold it to your face, you dream of drowning in flame. But we must leave Isolde now, for beyond her fire lies a deeper darkness, a final phase in the cult's evolution. Not a woman, not a sister, but a mother, and she was called Madame Sank. She was the only one they called mother, not lady, nor countess, nor saint, just Madame Sank. The name was whispered with both reverence and fear, like a prayer said backwards. It means Madame Blood, though no one dared say it aloud in French. She spoke every language of Europe, yet her accent belonged to none. Her age was unknowable, her origins erased, her face seen only once. She did not attend court, she summoned it. She ruled from a villa in the hills above Lyon, a structure so vast it dwarfed cathedrals, and so silent it seemed carved not by builders but by time itself. No birds flew overhead, no paths led to it. The woods around it bent away unnaturally, as if the trees themselves feared growing too close. By 1718, she controlled 12 sister houses, quiet, beautiful orphanages where only noblewomen served, and where the girls never cried. These girls, all orphans, all under 10, were said to be well kept, no whippings, no chains, their hair combed daily, their clothes of velvet and lace, but none of them spoke, and none of them left. She called them les petites, the blessed little ones, and she claimed their innocence was the last sacred thing in Europe. To outsiders, Madame Sank was a philanthropist, a visionary. She corresponded with doctors, bishops, even the Empress of Austria. Her seal was a crimson moth, her letters always written in red ink that never faded. She was said to appear rarely in deep hoods or carriages with smoked windows. But when she did, rooms fell silent. Candles flickered, clocks stopped. One bishop, Cardinal Valent, received an invitation to dine at her estate. He returned changed, quiet, pale. He resigned 3 weeks later and entered a monastery where he lived in silence for the rest of his life, never speaking again. Before he died, he left behind one page. It read, "She is not woman, nor beast, nor ghost. She is the mother of a hunger, and it is always hungry." Unlike the other sisters of the Crimson Veil, Madame Sank did not perform rites in hidden cellars or forgotten woods. She hosted them as events, quiet, exquisite gatherings of noblewomen dressed in mourning silks, where laughter was forbidden and music never played. They met in mirrored salons with crimson wallpaper and drank a clear wine that left the lips stained pink. But beneath the villa there were tunnels, miles of them, an abandoned network of ancient Roman catacombs, repurposed into chambers of ritual. Descriptions vary, but one surviving account, smuggled out by a German herbalist named Anneliese Roth, speaks of a chamber of 13 cradles, each carved from rose quartz and placed in a perfect circle around a basin the size of a small boat. Within the cradles, girls, living, unmoving, eyes open but blind, not drugged, suspended, held between breath and death by tinctures, songs, or something else. Their blood was not drained, but shared, threaded by a system of silver tubes that looped from cradle to basin and back again, a circle of flow, continuous, eternal. Madame Sank stood in the center, barefoot and gloved in white, her lips moving in rhythm to the heartbeat of the room. Anneliese tried to describe the feeling. It was not evil, not even cruel. It was ... serene. Like watching the tide pull out of a red ocean. Like something old was breathing through the walls, and she at the center. She wasn't worshipping, she was listening, as if waiting for something to speak back from the blood itself. Annalise escaped, though she burned her eyes with crushed belladonna to blind herself before she fled. Her reasoning, written in her final letter, is simple. I saw something in the basin, something beneath the reflection. It looked at me, and I believe if I saw it twice, I would never return. Madame Sank did not pursue her. She never needed to. By 1725, noble houses had pledged children to her orphanages. A dozen others donated the unwanted. Even a princess, Louise of Mecklenburg, was said to have given her second daughter in secret after a scandal. That child was never seen again. No one ever challenged her directly until 1723. A Jesuit scholar named Michel Durand wrote a treatise entitled Le Sang et la Veuve, The Blood and the Widow, which accused Madame Sank of operating a blood cult and outlined the full lineage of the Crimson Veil. He compiled accounts, cited hidden archives, even referenced Bishop Jan's original journal. It was 480 pages. It was printed once. Every copy was destroyed within the month. Durand was found in his abbey garden, his body untouched, his blood gone. Only one sentence remained in his final notes. She is not the beginning, but she is the gate. And then silence. Madame Sank vanished from the record by 1725. Her villa was struck by lightning during a storm and burned to the foundations. No bodies were found, no girls, no remains. Only a single object survived, an ivory comb soaked in red, left in the center of the ashes. But the Crimson Veil did not die, it adapted. Where once it drew power from blood, now it drew it from memory, from belief, from myth. And the next sister to rise would turn the cult into something far more terrifying, not hidden, not whispered, but celebrated. Her name was the Widow of Winterglass, and her season had only begun. Her mansion stood alone, on the edge of a frozen lake, in a place where winter never seemed to end, and the sun rose without warmth. Locals called it Winterglass, though no map bore that name, and no road led to it. The house was not built. It simply appeared sometime after 1731, following a storm of black hail and frost that killed every crow for a mile in all directions. The woman who lived there was known only as the widow. She claimed no surname, bore no title, and yet held gatherings where kings sent daughters and bishops sent letters begging counsel. She wore gowns like spun ice, diamonds sewn into her veils. Her voice was said to be too calm, as if spoken from memory, like someone quoting a life they no longer lived. But her beauty was what drew them. That eerie, perfect stillness. Skin pale as alabaster dipped in snowlight. Lips the soft shade of frozen berries. Eyes that did not blink, only shimmered, as if they reflected not the world before her, but the world behind. They said she never aged, and they were right, because the Widow of Winterglass did not live in time. She preserved it. She fed on it. The first accounts come from a young nobleman named Emile de Roux, sent to her for treatment after a riding injury left his face disfigured. He returned 3 months later, flawless, not just healed, transformed. His scars were gone, yes, but so were the freckles from his childhood, the gray in his temples, the slight bow of his spine. He looked younger, unnaturally younger. He was also silent. He never spoke again. Not once, But he wrote, obsessively, in small ledgers he kept sealed and hidden in a glass chest. His sister, Charlotte, opened them after his death at age 87, looking no older than 40. What she found were ritual records, detailed diagrams, schematics of the Winterglass estate, and passages, long, feverish passages, describing a chamber of mirrors beneath the lake itself. She keeps them alive, he wrote, but not awake. The children, they sleep, they dream. And she walks among those dreams, gathering moments, harvesting time like honey drawn from sleeping mouths. Charlotte tried to speak out. She vanished. Her body was found 6 years later, completely intact. Not a single wound, but every hair on her body had turned to frost. No one dared approach Winterglass after that, and yet the widow's fame grew. She began to be spoken of not in fear, but in fashion. Young women imitated her icy aesthetic. Portraits of her, though never sanctioned, became coveted, always showing her standing at a window, gazing out at a world long gone. She opened her academy in 1742, a sanctuary for lost girls, all orphans, all under 10. It was built adjacent to the lake, with corridors that reflected light even on moonless nights. Visitors described the halls as endless, always cold, always silent. The girls within were educated in philosophy, music, etiquette, and silence. The rule was simple: speak only when asked, cry only when alone. Never mention the mirrors. One servant, Ilse Becker, smuggled out a note. It was hidden in the binding of a book donated to a Dresden monastery. The mirrors are not mirrors. They do not reflect, they remember. I walked past one and saw myself as an old woman dying. I screamed. The widow appeared beside me. She said, "That is not a warning. That is a possibility. You may give it to me, if you like. I will take the time from your eyes, and you'll never age another day." Ilse's corpse was found inside the monastery crypt 3 days later, behind the sealed stone wall. How she got there, no one could say. But the cult had shifted. The crimson veil no longer sought only blood. That was the foundation, the original sacrament. But the widow of Winterglass brought something deeper. She fed on years, on sorrow, on the space between moments where a child first feels unwanted. She was not a priestess, she was a curator, and her collection grew. It is said that beneath Winterglass Lake, in a chamber sealed in silver ice, float 36 children, each suspended in perfect stasis, eyes closed, mouths slightly parted. From each of them spirals a thread, red, thin, pulsing, that loops upward into the widow's private chamber. Coiled like an umbilical web, she feeds slowly, patiently, a sip of time, a drop of breath, and in return she grants her gifts, youth, beauty, memory, erasure, to those who pay her price. Because Winterglass was never about destruction, it was about preservation. And preservation, in the wrong hands, becomes something monstrous. But even monsters have limits. And even the widow once feared someone, for there came a woman into her circle, not as a sister, but as a judge. She wore no veil, carried no blood, only truth, and her name was Contessa Noir, the one who remembered too much. She was born during a funeral. A noble girl, yes, but not in the way nobility is normally inherited. Her mother died as she was born, her blood still warm upon the marble steps of San Fiorenzo. Her father, a judge in Turin, raised her in silence. He did not smile, he did not punish. He only watched her, as if unsure whether she was his daughter or a sentence passed down from something older than justice. Her name was Noor, and she remembered everything, not merely events, but feelings, the smell of her mother's coffin, the exact number of steps to her father's study, the way the air tasted before the rain that night she first saw a girl disappear. It began with a whisper, a child in her neighborhood, gone, then another, then 5. Her father said nothing, but she saw the way his hands shook when he burned letters in the fireplace at dawn. She heard the names spoken in the dark by women passing beneath her window. The same words, again and again, Crimson Veil. She was only 13 when she began her collection, not of objects, but of disappearances. She kept lists, maps, threads of fate, scribbled in candlelight, and slowly the pattern emerged, not random, not chaotic, ritual, a rhythm like a second heartbeat beneath the city's surface. Girls missing near particular estates, orphanages funded by unseen benefactors, rumors of women who never aged, who moved from court to court, always just beyond the reach of history. At 16, inherited her father's library after he drowned in his own fountain, though no water was found in his lungs. She found his writings hidden behind the volumes of Roman law, diaries filled with entries about girls he had sentenced to orphanages, ones that no longer existed, homes that had been erased. At 17, she disappeared from society, and at 20, she reappeared in Venice, cloaked in widow's black, under a false name, renting a decaying palazzo that no one had lived in since the plague. Within a year, 11 noblewomen had come to her. Each whispered her name differently, some in reverence, some in fear, but all with the same hope that she had returned. They believed she was one of them, and she let them. Was not like the other sisters of the Crimson Veil. She performed no rites, took no blood. She only listened and remembered, because memory, she believed, was the only weapon against horror. She began to host recollections, silent salons held under gaslight and velvet. No music, no mirrors, just a single chair in the center of the room, where women came forward, one by one, and told their truths. Not confessions, not regrets, just memories of the children they had taken, the rituals they had led, the blood they had tasted. Never flinched, she recorded every word. And when the last woman left the room, she would place her palm on the velvet chair and whisper the name of the child she had never forgotten. Clara, aged 6. Taken from the hospice of St. Helene. You called her the quiet one. Her favorite color was blue. She sang in her sleep. Her mother's name was Therese. You burned her hair. But Clara remembered her name until the end, and the woman listening would break. One drowned herself in the canal. One went mad and carved the names of every child she'd taken into her own arms. One simply disappeared, leaving behind only her gloves, soaked in tears. Was not a killer. She was a mirror. Not the kind that reflects faces, the kind that shows the soul. It is said that the widow of Winterglass sent her an invitation, that Isolde's fire dimmed when she spoke her name, that Madame sang if she was still alive, wept for the first and only time in her long life, because was not an enemy, she was a reckoning, and she had one goal, to remember the forgotten. Her writings, called the Red Archive, exist in fragmented form today, scattered across rare bookrooms and private vaults, often mislabeled as fiction or heresy or psychological horror. They contain no spells, no rituals, only names, descriptions, facts. the invisible ink of truth burned into the page by grief. One passage is repeated throughout the archive. It is not blood that gives them power. It is silence. It is the forgetting, the casting away, the quiet hunger in the walls. So long as the world forgets, the veil will never lift. But knew something else, something darker, because in her final letter, she confessed that she had once seen beneath the veil, just once, a door she was too afraid to open. It was not made of wood, nor stone, nor metal. It was made of flesh, and something was knocking from the other side. She ended her letter with a question. What if the veil was never meant to be worn? What if it was meant to keep something in? That letter was dated 1750. No one ever saw Noir again, but her palazzo still stands, empty, windows covered in velvet, and the canal beside it runs red every year on the winter solstice, as if the city itself has not forgotten, as if the children remember. After the disappearance of Noir, a silence fell. Not peace, no, but the kind of silence that hangs over a battlefield before the vultures arrive. Europe's noble courts turned inward. The Enlightenment dawned in salons of powdered men with ink-stained hands, while revolution fermented in the blood of the poor. But even as empires trembled and monarchs lost their heads, the crimson veil endured, not in palaces or temples now, but in paper, in ink, in theater, because art has always been the safest place to hide a horror, and she understood that perfectly. She was called La Prima Rosamund, and though no one could say when she was born or where she learned her craft, by 1761 she ruled the stage of Vienna with an elegance that unsettled even seasoned aristocrats. Her performances left audiences breathless, unnerved, unable to speak for hours, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she seemed wrong, too graceful, too perfect, too ancient. Her eyes held centuries. She never blinked on stage. She never missed a note, and she never accepted roses thrown by the crowd unless they came from children. Always children. When asked about her past, she would laugh and say only, "I've worn many names, but I always play the same role." No one knew where she lived. No servant ever saw her eat. Her gowns were sewn from lace, said to be centuries old, and her performances were always themed around lost girls, ghost children, and mothers who forgot their own names. The aristocracy adored her. They never asked why no children under 10 were allowed at her shows, but the children knew. In alleyways and broken tenements, stories spread of boys who whistled her arias in mockery and were found days later, mute, of girls who drew her in chalk and vanished by midnight, of a boy who claimed he saw her without makeup in the alley behind the theater, her mouth sewn shut and eyes full of smoke. He died in his sleep the next night. The local priest called her a spirit in velvet and tried to bar her from performing. He was found inside the confessional, weeping blood, unable to remember his own name. His last sermon consisted of a single word, repeated 33 times, curtain, because that's what Rosamund understood. She didn't need altars. She had a stage. And each of her performances, each opera, ballet, or ghost play, was not a fiction. It was a reenactment, a ritual draped in metaphor, the drowning of a girl in Act 2, the burning of an orphanage in the finale, the final aria, always sung by a veiled soprano holding a child's toy soaked in red silk. Those were not metaphors. Those were memories. She did not feed on blood. She fed on the retelling. Because if no one dares to speak the truth, then the only truth that survives is the one that is performed. And Rosamund performed it beautifully. But her most infamous piece, the one that was banned in 3 cities before it even opened, was called Litanies for the Hollow Night, a full-length opera written in a dead language, accompanied only by cello and harp, staged entirely in candlelight, and featuring no living children, only dolls, porcelain, life-size, and dressed in the garb of lost orphanages. Audiences fainted during Act 3. One woman tore her eyes out during the final crescendo, claiming the dolls were blinking at her in time with the music. But the true horror was not the opera. It was the curtain call. Because when Rosamund took her final bow, she always removed her gloves, and her hands were not hers. Small, childlike, pale as wax, with fingernails too new, as if borrowed, as if taken. Someone finally tried to stop her. A composer named Anselm Kreutz, who claimed she was not a performer, but a vessel of atrocity. He composed a cantarapora, an exorcism in the form of music, designed to dispel whatever spirit she had become. It premiered once. Rosamund attended, veiled and silent. The music was played, and every member of the orchestra died that night. Violins split, cellos snapped. Anselm was found with his mouth stitched shut by piano wire, his sheet music soaked in blood not his own. The opera was never performed again. Rosamund retired from the stage soon after, but her legacy persisted. A cult of actresses began to rise, women who whispered of the final role, who believed that every performance was a rite, every costume a relic. They painted their lips with wax, their cheeks with powdered bone, and spoke only in song. They called themselves the chorus of the Crimson Curtain, but no one led them, not anymore, because Rosamund had passed into something more than myth, and somewhere, hidden behind the curtain of memory and performance, the veil itself thickened. Not in blood this time, not in silence, but in story. Because the greatest trick the cult ever pulled was teaching us to applaud it. If Rosamund had turned ritual into opera, then the seamstress of Wormwood Hill turned it into inheritance. She was not a performer. She did not seek applause. She worked in silence, in thread and bone and memory. She left no diary, no will, no portrait, but what she left behind were garments, gowns, corsets, shoes, veils, each one sewn by hand, using fabric that could not be traced, dyed in hues no merchant sold, threaded with lace that shimmered faintly under candlelight, as if woven from moonlight soaked in grief. She appeared sometime around 1778, near the Black Forest, in the village of Selbach, a place already steeped in superstition, where wolves howled without pause, and children were buried with mirrors placed over their faces to keep their souls from wandering. No one knew her real name. She was simply the seamstress. She took in orphans, yes, always girls, always young. She fed them, clothed them, and, one by one, taught them the art of dressing, not fashion. No, something deeper. To the villagers, she was kind. She offered warmth in winter, mended broken coats, gifted shoes to the poor. But she asked for one thing in return, a single strand of a dead child's hair. No one questioned it. Superstition ran deep, and the seamstress smiled gently when she asked. What they did not know was that she catalogued each one, labeled them, matched hair to fabric, matched fabric to grief. And once she had enough hair, enough sorrow, enough silence, she began to stitch the past into the present. Her dresses were more than clothes, they were repositories, each one embroidered with names, hidden in the lining, beneath buttons, folded into hymns, names of the forgotten, the missing, the taken. She sold them only to women of wealth, women who understood. They came by carriage, from Vienna, from Marseille, from old castles in Bohemia, their eyes hollow, their fingers heavy with rings. They came for one reason, to wear the memory of innocence. Each dress granted something different, a youth restored, a guilt erased, a voice returned, but only while the dress remained on the body. The moment it was removed, the moment the silk left skin, the memories came flooding back, and not their own. The dress did not erase memory, it simply borrowed it, and the children it was taken from, they remembered. One woman, a Duchess of Württemberg, was found dancing naked in the snow, her skin covered in names scratched with fingernails. She kept repeating, "It's not my blood. I wore it. I wore her." Another, a Spanish opera patroness, disappeared for 12 years after wearing the seamstress's mourning gown. When she returned, her eyes were white, and she spoke only one phrase. I felt her breath inside the bodice. Even stranger were the shoes. They never fit quite right. Always a little too tight. Always moving, as if they adjusted to the wearer's hesitation. One girl who tried them on was seen walking out into the lake at dawn, the shoes still visible beneath the surface days later, unmoved, anchored. The seamstress did not stop. She opened a school. She called it La Maison de la Peau, Silences, the House of Silent Skin. It was not a school in the ordinary sense. No curriculum, no books, only rooms of girls, threading memories into garments, whispering songs in languages no one had taught them. They stitched by candlelight, and the flames never flickered. Some of the girls were blind, others deaf, all of them silent, and they worked, and they remembered. Because that was her great work, the seamstress's final masterpiece, to trap memory in fabric, to sew loss into elegance, to make sorrow wearable. One priest tried to burn her house down. It refused to ignite. The walls bled wax. The flames curled back toward his hands, and he died blind, with his rosary melted into his throat. The seamstress did not flee. She simply disappeared. Her dresses, however, did not. They still turn up in auctions, in vaults, in forgotten wardrobes of dead estates. One was worn by a bride in 1910. She drowned herself before the reception. When the gown was retrieved, it was dry. Another was displayed in a Paris gallery in 1996. The curator quit after claiming he heard it humming to itself at night. Each dress bears a mark, stitched in white, on the inside of the collar, a child's name, a number, and the phrase, "Return what was taken." The crimson veil did not die with the seamstress. It changed fabric, changed medium. And where once it lived in ritual and performance, now it lives in fashion. In the heirlooms you inherit, the veil in your grandmother's drawer, the dress no one wears anymore but refuses to throw away. And still, the names remain, because the seamstress's greatest curse was not that the garments whispered. It was that the children inside them never stopped stitching. If the seamstress bound memory into cloth, then the governess of thorns taught the forgotten how to speak again, but not in words, in obedience. Her name was Miss Loon, and she arrived in England sometime in the winter of 1783, not by ship, but on foot, walking across the frozen river, Severn, her boots leaving no prints in the frost. She came with a suitcase of books, a parasol fashioned from bone, and no past, no birth record, no family name, only a single reference from an unknown noblewoman, sealed in crimson wax. She founded a school, St. Precious School for Unclaimed Girls, tucked between heaths and hedgerows in the Wiltshire countryside. To the villagers, it was a blessing, a haven for the poor and the abandoned. Children who once starved in gutters now wore pressed uniforms and sang hymns in perfect Latin. But they never smiled, not once. St. Precious was immaculate. No dust, no sound. The windows were always open, even in rain. The halls were lit by lamps that never needed oil, and the gardens, vast, overgrown with red thorn bushes, seemed to shift shape when no one watched them. Miss Loon ran the school herself. No servants, no staff, only her and the girls. She taught them etiquette, handwriting, silence. She taught them how to curtsy without breath, how to kneel without pain, how to walk without shadow, and she taught them how to forget. Each girl who entered the school had her name taken, not changed, taken. It was not spoken again, not by others, not by themselves. In its place, a number, carved, not sewn, into the lining of their collars. If they cried, they were sent to the garden. If they screamed, they were returned from it, changed. One girl, known only as number 34, escaped in 1786 and wandered into the village, barefoot, her feet bleeding thorns. She spoke a single sentence before dying at the chapel steps. We are roots. We grow down, not up. The vicar buried her in holy ground. 2 weeks later, the ground beneath her grave cracked open. The coffin was empty. Miss Loon issued no statement. She didn't need to, because her method was not punishment. It was discipline. Not in the old sense, not canes and chains, but something deeper, more precise. She taught the girls rituals of erasure, how to walk in a perfect spiral without ever turning, how to whisper backwards into water, how to balance a candle on the spine and not let the flame flicker even as you weep. Each ritual was a lesson, and each lesson brought them further away from who they had been and closer to who she needed them to become. You see, Miss Loon was not running a school, she was cultivating a language, a grammar of sorrow. She believed that the most obedient child was not the one who followed rules, but the one who no longer knew they'd been broken, the one who forgot what freedom felt like, and that was the true purpose of St. Precious, because obedience to the crimson veil was not a virtue, it was a sacrament. Each year, on the winter solstice, a new rite was held, never witnessed, never recorded, but always known. Villagers reported the air humming, sheep miscarried, trees bled sap that smelled of salt and smoke, and always, the next morning, one more girl would vanish from the school register. Yet the number of students never changed, because a new girl always arrived, already dressed, already silent, already knowing the rules. It is said that in the deepest chamber of the school, beneath the chapel, behind a door shaped like a woman's silhouette, there sits a book bound in skin, written in no known language. And when Miss Loon reads from it, the girls line up in silence and kneel as one. She never raises her voice. She doesn't need to, because each child now hears her not through ears, but through the soft ache in their bones, through the tiny thorn-shaped scars left behind the ears, through the dreams they no longer remember. The governess of thorns had no ambition, no need for fame or wealth. Her gift to the cult was far more enduring. She taught the forgotten how to forget themselves. St. Precious still stands. It is abandoned, they say. But if you place your ear to the chapel wall at midnight, on the longest night of the year, you can hear the pages turning. You can hear the girls reciting their names in reverse. And if you stay long enough, you might hear your own name whispered back to you, not in your voice, but in the voice of a girl who died long ago and never stopped learning. You might think by now that the cult had exhausted its forms: blood, memory, obedience, art. But the Crimson Veil was never merely about methods. It was about immortality, not of the flesh, but of pattern. And no one understood pattern like Lady Adria Venelace, known in whispers as the archivist of Ash. She did not live in a palace, nor a house. She lived in a vault, beneath the burnt remains of a monastery in Carcassonne, where fire had once consumed every monk. Every book, every holy word, every surface above was scorched black. But beneath it, thrived the archive. It began, they say, as a room of scrolls rescued from heresy trials. But it grew, and it kept growing, absorbing lost grimoires, forbidden Bibles, trial transcripts, apocryphal gospels, burned letters, secret autopsies, exile testimonies, and execution ledgers, and every one of them shared a single trait. They mentioned a missing child. Lady Venelace did not gather stories out of pity. She was not a mother, she was a keeper, a watcher of patterns. Her chamber was said to be circular, 1,000 drawers, each marked not by a name, but by a symbol, a tooth, a flame, a spiral, a crescent, a weeping eye. She spoke rarely. Her skin was dry, gray with dust, her fingertips stained black from ash, and her voice, when heard, was as brittle as old paper catching fire. She walked with a cane carved from a burned crucifix, and the hem of her dress left trails of soot wherever she passed. No one knew her age. They only knew this: she had read every account of every child who had ever vanished in Europe from 1302 to 1809, and she had filed them. She claimed not to serve the Crimson Veil, she claimed to contain it, but her writings say otherwise. In one preserved codex, copied by a heretical scribe under threat of death, she writes, "The veil is not one body, it is a braid of women, each one a strand of will, pain, and desire. They do not serve a god. They do not worship the devil. They believe in only one truth, that what is forgotten becomes theirs. And so they hunt not flesh, but history." Her vault was organized accordingly. She built the map of vanishment, a spider web of crimson thread stretched across 5 concentric tables, with black pins denoting disappearances. The patterns were elegant, the curves sang. One Jesuit scholar who viewed the map went mad within minutes. He claimed to see faces within the threads, not sewn in, but living behind them like insects behind silk. Lady Venelace did not flinch. She began charting the phases of the moon against the cycles of the rites. She noticed the disappearances aligned not with dates, but frequencies, echoes, like waves. And what disturbed her most was this: the gaps are not random. They are waiting to be filled. The veil is not active, it is predictive. She believed that every girl taken was not an accident, but a necessary variable in a ritual of vast complexity. A long-form liturgy spread across generations, across languages, across narratives, and she feared one thing above all: completion, because a ritual is safe only so long as it is incomplete. And she believed the Crimson Veil was nearing the final stitch. In 1802, Lady Venelace vanished for 3 weeks. When she returned, she had gouged out her left eye and burned her right hand. She spoke only once before sealing herself in her vault forever. It has a name. It is not a god. It is not a curse. It is a shape made of girls, and it is almost finished. No one saw her again, but her archive remains, buried beneath a private foundation in France, supposedly empty. But scholars claim that, late at night, drawers open by themselves, that documents lost in other countries reappear there, scorched but legible, that the vault breathes, not quickly, not loudly, but with the long, patient rhythm of something waiting for the final name, the last girl, the last note in the pattern. And above it all, carved into the blackened walls, a phrase appears again and again, scratched by desperate fingers, in Latin, French, German, even Old Church, Slavonic. The pattern is the prison, and the girls are the walls. There are patterns made of thread, and there are patterns made of sound, and she knew how to weave both. Her name was never spoken. Her followers called her only the Bell Matron, and her tower stood alone on the cliffs above Parga, in the Ionian coastlands, where the sea cries louder than the wind. There were no roads to reach it, no paths, only a series of stone steps carved directly into the cliffs, smoothed by centuries of bare feet, small feet, children's feet. No bells rang from her tower, not in the ordinary sense. They were too small, too many, too close. Each hung from a thin strand of blackened silver. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, not cast from metal, but grown from teeth. Milk teeth, the first teeth of lost girls, soaked in brine, boiled in myrrh, and suspended in silence. They called it the carillon of remembrance. It did not chime, it shivered. The bell matron did not write music, she did not teach hymns. Her music was not heard with the ears, but with the lungs, a pressure that arrived before the sound, a suffocation just beneath the ribs, an ache in the throat, as if something were trying to be sung through you from the inside out. She took in only mute girls, no names, no histories, no languages. She trained them to speak in bells. Each bell was assigned a girl, each girl a rhythm, each rhythm a memory, and each memory a summoning. The bell matron's greatest ritual was held every 7 years. At the moment the tides turned black, locals knew to shutter windows. Even the goats were herded inland, but the sound always found its way in. They called it the tolling of the orphan sea. Those who heard it often forgot something, a name, a place, a daughter. One man slit his wrists after claiming he could still hear the bells under his skin. He said his heartbeat had changed tempo. It no longer beat for him, it beat for her. But the ritual was not an attack, it was a resonance. Because the bell matron believed sound was memory's true language, that the bones remember before the mind, that the body keeps score long after the soul gives up. And so she composed her great work, a symphony made not of notes, but of loss. It is said she tuned her bells with the fingertips of drowned girls. Each bell held not just a pitch, but a person. And when played together, they did not produce music. They reconstructed a life. One scholar, who managed to record fragments of the tolling before he lost the ability to read, described it as like hearing a girl's entire existence played backward through water, through pain, through absence, from her final breath to her first cry. It's not music, it's a resurrection, but the kind that forgets to bring the soul back. And what of the girls? The ones who played the bells, they never aged. Or rather, they aged differently. Some in the hair, but not the face. Some in the teeth, but not the bones. Their hands grew long, elegant, veined like roots, but their eyes remained infantile, watery, expectant. They lived not in time, but in chime. The bell matron marked their transitions not by birthdays, but by silence. When a girl lost her rhythm, she was laid in the sea, not drowned, returned, because the matron believed the ocean was not water. It was echo, the place where all forgotten sounds go. And so the cult endured, not in rituals of blood, not in veils or ashes, but in the trembling air between bell and breath, until 1814, when the cliff cracked. Some say it was an earthquake, others a judgment. The entire tower slipped into the Ionian depths, bells and girls and matron alike. The sea was silent for 49 days. Then, on the 50th, a sailor claimed to hear a melody in the waves, faint, flickering, just below consciousness. He died that night, humming lullabies he never learned. Today, some say if you place your ear to a conch shell taken from those waters, you can hear the bells, not ringing, remembering. And if you listen too long, you'll forget who you are and begin to remember someone else, a girl, lost, nameless, and waiting for her bell. By the early 19th century, the world was changing. The rationalists were winning. Candles gave way to gaslight, cloisters to lecture halls, and with every new textbook pressed by the machines, another myth was crushed beneath the weight of science. The mind, they claimed, was a machine. Memory was biology. Evil, a defect, not a doctrine. And yet, somewhere behind the polished brass and polished lies, she lingered still. Her name in court papers was Dr. Magdalena Greiss, but in the fevered journals of the forgotten, she was known as the surgeon of the second womb. She trained in Vienna, interned in Paris, and was expelled from both for inappropriate experimentation upon non-consenting minors. But no charges ever held, no body ever emerged. She disappeared into the folds of academic obscurity, leaving behind only footnotes and specimens. She did not worship beauty. She worshipped reversal, the undoing of damage, the unslicing of time. She believed that death itself was not the end, merely an error in biology, a failure of narrative. And what was a surgeon, if not an editor of the flesh? Her clinic, once established, bore no signage. It was said to have no windows. The few who entered, always women of means, left changed, some younger, some colder, some without the ability to speak of what had been done to them. The procedure was never named, but the whispers persisted. Second womb, a process by which the body could be reborn, not through gestation, but through excision, to carve away what had aged, to stitch in what had been lost, to sow silence into the places memory once lived. Dr. Greiss did not advertise. She invited. Her targets were precise. Noblewomen who had witnessed something, survivors of rites they could not explain, participants in rituals they pretended to forget, and above all, women who had once been girls taken by the cult and returned. You see, some girls were not sacrificed, some were used, and then sent back into the world like broken dolls in fine dresses. But even broken dolls remember when they are handled roughly, and so Greiss took them. She opened them, not to heal, but to harvest. Her theory was simple. Trauma lives in tissue, memory in marrow. If one could isolate the flesh that remembers, one could transfer it, graft it, reassign it. And so she built a map of pain. She called it the Atlas Dolores, a body-wide chart showing where fear ripens, where sorrow festers, where screams rot after being swallowed for decades. It was not medical, it was liturgical. Her assistants, known only as the Pale Daughters, carried her notes in surgical scrolls made of skin. They did not speak. Their mouths were covered by silk masks dyed with tinctures of sedated blood. Some were rumored to be former patients, others children born during the rites and never registered as real. She kept them immaculate, because cleanliness, she said, was the difference between resurrection and rot. But her true obsession was with one organ above all, the uterus. She believed it remembered not just gestation, but everything. Loss, grief, music, betrayal, all stored in the second womb, a secret chamber behind the veil of anatomy. The Church says the soul lives in the heart, she once wrote. Fools, the soul lives in the absence, the empty, the chamber waiting to become. In her final years, she performed a series of surgeries known only as the 7 regressions, each one on a woman who had aged without aging, survivors of the seamstress, the belle matron, the governess, women who could not die but wished to forget, and Grace gave them what they wanted, piece by piece. She removed the memory from the flesh, but flesh, you see, never gives anything back freely, and so the memories once extracted had to go somewhere. They were stored, preserved, in glass wombs filled with saline and regret, dozens of them, shelved like relics, numbered and sealed, each one holding not a fetus, but a scream, not audible, not sonic, but psychic, a pulsing, unseen shriek that infected anyone who looked too long into the jar. Visitors reported migraines, night terrors, nosebleeds, sudden relapses into childhood habits they thought long gone. One researcher lapsed into a coma, murmuring the same phrase for 8 days, "Put me back in." In 1822, the clinic burned, no cause determined, no survivors, no remains. But local workers claimed that the fire sounded strange. It didn't roar, it wept, as if the building itself had lungs, as if the walls, heavy with centuries of blood and forgotten girls, were sobbing as they died. And beneath it all, a single echo. This was not birth, this was a caesura in the soul. The cult never spoke of her again, but some say the wombs still exist, buried deep in medical vaults, mislabeled, misfiled, ignored by modern science, waiting, because memory doesn't die, it curdles. And when it curdles long enough, it becomes mother again. It is often assumed that the crimson veil dissolved into dust with the passing of the old world, drowned in fire, buried in salt, dissected by reason. But what if the cult had simply evolved? What if, like a fungus deprived of light, it only grew deeper, more secretive, more refined? Because there is one chapter in this history, too delicate, too calculated, too refined to have been born from hysteria or hunger. A chapter written not in screams, nor ink, but in glass. Her name was Countess Laureline Edivane, and she ruled not over land, but over perfume. The House of Edivane was the most exclusive fragrance house in Europe at the turn of the 19th century. Its bottles were never sold, only gifted, always to women of high status, widows of impeccable mourning, or the mysteriously well-preserved. Its motto, to wear what is no longer here. Laureline was not young, but neither was she old. Her face bore the serene cruelty of alabaster saints, and her fingers moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades working with poisons. Her salons smelled not of roses, but of memory, dense, cloying, faintly sweet, with a note of ruin. She wore black tulle at all times, even in summer. And always, always, gloves of white silk. No one ever saw her remove them. She was known for crafting only 7 perfumes in her lifetime. Each one was said to evoke not a scent, but a presence. La Chute d'Enfance, a perfume that made even hardened duchesses weep without understanding why. Veuve de l'Innocence, said to cause fainting in those who had lost a child. Cendre de Barces, a scent that reportedly made women dream of cradles, rocking alone in the dark. Each perfume was created from secret ingredients. Some guessed exotic florals, some guessed resins, dust, powdered glass. None guessed what it truly was, because Laureline, as she later confessed in a letter never meant to be opened, had discovered a new method of embalming grief. She did not preserve bodies, she preserved essence. She had inherited, through channels too dark to mention, a technique first whispered in Assyrian funerary cults, refined through Carthaginian rites, and perfected in the cloisters of dead French nuns. A process by which the dying breath of a forgotten girl, the final exhale, the last whisper before the world turned its back, could be captured, filtered through obsidian funnels, condensed over flame, and turned into oil, not metaphor, oil. Each drop of her perfumes contained one breath, one death, one orphan. Laureline did not see this as cruelty. She saw it as preservation. "I do not kill them," she once wrote in the margins of her ledger. "I simply carry them. I make them impossible to forget." She believed memory required a medium. Cloth fades, ink burns, but scent is immortal. The olfactory is the last to decay, the first to awaken. A scent can bring you to tears long before the mind understands why. And so she turned her victims into relics. When women wore her perfumes, they were not wearing fragrance, they were wearing mourning. And mourning, Laureline knew, could be addictive. She created a following, not a coven, not a cult, a clientele. Women who returned again and again, begging for more. Not because they needed to be beautiful, but because they needed to remember something they could not name, a feeling, a face, a cry in the night. The house of Edivane prospered for 2 decades, until the Mirabelle incident. In 1829, a young countess named Élodie de Mirabelle wore l'Orpheline to a ball in Prague. Within 20 minutes, 3 other women in the ballroom had collapsed. One tore off her mask, crying for a sister she never had. Another convulsed, screaming the name Gisette until her throat bled. The third simply walked into a fountain and drowned. The perfume had triggered something, not grief, recognition. That night, Countess Laureline burned her own house. Some say she was inside. Others claim she walked into the Seine, trailing white smoke from her gloves. Her perfumes were banned, bottles were destroyed, recipes lost, but some remain, hidden in vaults. One bottle surfaced in 1987 in an estate sale in Bavaria. When opened, it caused 5 attendees to faint. The bottle was resealed. The auction house later claimed it had leaked, but one staff member, a woman from Belgrade, later said she had heard a girl's voice inside the bottle, whispering, laughing, then sobbing. And that, dear listener, is how the Crimson Veil continued. Not through terror, not through fire, but through elegance. A silk handkerchief, a glass bottle, a scent that cannot be washed away. Because what Laureline taught them was this: you don't need to kill a child to erase her. You simply need to wear her long enough, until she forgets she was ever alive. By the time the 1830s arrived, the world had grown almost too bright for monsters. Gaslight bathed the cities in an artificial sun. Trains thundered through once-forgotten valleys. Photography froze the soul of every widow and thief alike. Even grief had begun to be categorized, made clinical, mapped like a symptom. No room remained for myth. But the crimson veil did not disappear. It simply changed its shape once more. This time into a mirror. Her name was Madame Elodie Saint Denis, and she was neither surgeon nor songstress. She was a collector. Her estate outside Arles, known as La Glace Silenceuse, the silent mirror, was a place of whispered invitation, never mentioned in polite society. A circular chateau, built without corners or staircases. Only ramps and winding rooms that fed into themselves like a serpent eating its own reflection. But the rooms were not filled with art, nor antiques. They were filled with mirrors. Over 900, some full-length, some oval, some jagged, all different, none the same. Hung not to reflect light, but to capture something else. You see, Madame Saint Denis believed in a theory once attributed to Paracelsus and revived in whispers by alchemists, that mirrors remember, that reflections, especially those caught in terror or grief, do not vanish when we walk away. They linger, trapped inside the silvered glass, feeding on our absence. She called them ghosts of light, but these weren't hauntings, not in the vulgar sense. They were recordings of despair. Her collection grew through purchase, inheritance, and darker means. A cracked mirror from a drowned orphanage. A dressing glass taken from a girl's asylum bed. A vanity once owned by a childless countess who died kneeling before it. Her hands bloodied with scratches she left in her own reflection. But Elodie did not merely hang them, she listened to them. Each night, after the wind died and the lamps were dimmed to an amber hush, she would walk barefoot through the mirror halls, trailing a bell of glass behind her. The bell never rang, not until one of the mirrors spoke, not in words, but in images. Madame Saint Denis had developed a method known as reversing the gaze, a practice in which the viewer becomes the viewed. Stand long enough, still enough, silent enough before a mirror that has once caught death, and you will begin to see, not yourself, but what the mirror last remembered. She trained orphaned girls to do it, always girls, always silent. They called them reversants, girls raised without names, taught to never look at themselves, only into the glass, taught to breathe without fogging the pain, to blink in rhythm with the last girl the mirror had seen. Some wept while training, some forgot their own reflections permanently. Others simply vanished into the mirrors themselves. Because that was Elodie's secret. Mirrors, she said, were not objects, they were mouths, and some mouths learned to hunger. She kept a ledger, Le Livre des Echoes, listing every mirror's hunger. Some craved anger, some neglect, but many, too many, hungered for innocence, for the last breath of a girl who didn't know what was being taken from her until the very end. The most infamous mirror in her collection was called Le Miroir des, the mirror of the forsaken. It stood 10 feet tall and required 2 girls to approach. It had no frame. Its surface seemed darker than glass, like water remembered. And it was said that once every 7 years, it reflected someone who had died outside its sight, but only if that someone had died forgotten. In 1837, a Prussian widow named Greta von Leguan arrived at the estate. She brought with her a girl, mute, withdrawn, dressed in mourning, and demanded that the child be reflected properly. Elodie complied. The girl was brought to the mirror of the Forsaken. The bell rang, and for one breathless moment, two reflections stared back. One was the girl, the other, a child no one had ever seen before, eyes open, mouth stitched shut, hands pressed against the other side of the glass. The girl collapsed. When she awoke, she no longer recognized Greta. She no longer recognized herself. She whispered a name that had never belonged to her, and Elodie Saint Denis simply smiled and wrote it down, because she understood what the others had only begun to suspect. Reflection is possession. Identity is a trick of symmetry. And mirrors, if trained properly, can harvest not just light, but self. La Glace Silences burned in 1840. Of course it did. The fire started in the central mirror hall. Witnesses said the flames didn't reflect in any of the glass. They were swallowed. Elodie was never found. Only the bell remained, cracked still. And if you ever find a mirror in an antique shop with a faint thumbprint on the inside of the glass, do not touch it. Do not clean it. Do not look too long, because you may not be the one who blinks first. By mid-century, the crimson veil had become a whisper sewn into lace, a reflection etched behind closed eyelids, a grief that wore no face. It did not need to recruit any more. Women came to it willingly, some even without knowing why, but no one embraced it so openly or so flamboyantly as Vicomtesse Isidora Delumbra, the so-called the Tray widow of Marseille. She was born into scandal, married into ruin, and emerged from both as a force of myth, a patroness of the grotesque, a woman who claimed she had never laughed because to laugh is to forget the corpse in the cradle. Her obsession was puppetry. Not the toy box marionettes of children's tales, but full-body wooden automata, clothed in mourning garb, wearing glass eyes plucked from taxidermy suppliers, some wired to blink, others posed mid-curtsy. She called them her sisters of sorrow, and she performed with them. Every Friday, at dusk, the Vicomtesse would open the black velvet doors of her private opera house, Le Trait des Larmes Retenues, the theater of held-back tears. Only women were allowed inside. The rules were strict. No applause, no questions, and no leaving before the final bow. Inside, the performances were silent. The stage was lit by candelabras in the shape of twisted angels. The curtains were stitched from veils donated by widows who'd buried a child. And the puppets moved, not by strings, but by hands inside them. Or at least, it seemed that way. Some swore they heard breathing beneath the costumes. Others claimed they saw lips inside the puppets' mouths. Lips that moved ever so slightly, as if trying to form words that no one had ever taught them. The plays had no dialogue, only gesture, only suffering. Titles included: The Girl Who Was Forgotten Before She Was Born, The Fifth Sister Who Did Not Cry, The Banquet Where the Orphans Were Served. The audience did not clap, they wept, quietly, decorously, as if mourning someone they could not name. And after each show, the Vicomtesse would walk among them, her black-gloved hands extended, pressing a pale silk envelope into each lap. Inside was a single phrase, handwritten in ink made from soot and camphor: "You were seen." It was said she performed 1,000 shows over 13 years. Each time, the puppets changed slightly. A new face, a fresh bruise, an added hand. Some even grew taller, too tall. And then came the final show, the one no one speaks of directly. It was called the matron's wedding. Only 13 women were invited, all former patrons, all childless. They entered the theater as dusk fell. None ever exited. When investigators arrived 3 days later, the entire opera house had collapsed inwards, not burned, not broken, but folded like cloth pulled through a slit in the air. No bodies, no ashes, just one puppet, still standing in the rubble, dressed as a bride. Her veil was soaked in something dark, and stitched into the hymn, barely visible, a phrase: "We were not made to dance for you. We were made to remember dancing." To this day, no record remains of the Vicomtesse's face. Every portrait destroyed, every mirror in her estate shattered from within. But one rumor persists, that she was not the last Delumbra, that each woman in the audience of her final show had given something before they left, and that something still lives inside a theater that cannot be found, except on moonless nights, when grief wears gloves, and the stage curtains smell faintly of milk, rot, and song, while some women of the crimson veil draped their rituals in veils and velvet. Others wore nothing but truth, raw, peeling, and tender as an unbandaged wound. None more so than Mother Agnethy of Moravia, the midwife of the mute saints. Her chapel stood alone, rooted in a forest where no path remained. Officially, it did not exist. It was struck from every diocesan map in 1832, declared heretical, then mysteriously re-sanctified 3 years later without explanation. No congregation was listed, no masses recorded, no births, and yet there were always infants crying. They say the air near the chapel tasted faintly of iron and fennel, that even birds avoided its belfry, and the wild dogs howled each night from the edge of the woods, but never entered. The locals called it the Wamhouse, not because children were born there, but because something older was waiting to be delivered. Mother Agnethy was not a nun in any sanctioned order. She wore a habit, of course, wool stitched with thorns, real thorns, pressed into the fabric like embroidery, drawing blood with every movement. She bled daily, she bled on purpose, and her liturgy was labor. Every Friday, just before dawn, she performed a ritual she called the contraction of the unnamed. No altar, no scripture, only a tub, iron, cold, filled with water, turned cloudy by milk and herbs. At its rim, 7 wooden dolls, carved by hand, each missing their eyes. She would enter the water, fully clothed, and begin to chant. The chant had no words, only breaths, the kind a woman makes between sobs, between screams, between the last push and the moment she realizes her child will not cry. One witness, a midwife, a apprentice, who fled the ceremony and lived in silence for the rest of her life, claimed the ritual made the room fold inward, that she heard babies wailing from the walls, and that the dolls seemed to watch her even without eyes, because the dolls were not just decoration, they were receivers. Each represented a stillborn girl that Mother Agnethy had named, not in pity, but in defiance. Because, you see, she believed the church had erred, that infants who died unnamed, unbaptized, were not lost to God, but to something else. Limbo is not emptiness, she wrote. It is asterisk hunger without teeth. It waits, and the girls wait with it. She claimed her rituals brought them back, not whole, not warm, but present. The women who visited her chapel, always alone, always with heavy eyes and heavier hearts, did not speak their intentions aloud. They entered, they bled, and they left behind hair, wrapped around bits of bone, sealed in waxen envelopes, and placed beneath the floorboards in a pattern no scholar has yet deciphered. It was said that Mother Agnethy could summon the memory of a womb, not just the memory of motherhood, but of the mother herself, back through the chain of generations. Sometimes a visitor would emerge from the chapel, unable to speak her own name, only the name of her grandmother. Sometimes she would scream a name that never belonged to her, then collapse. But those who returned said the pain was worth it, because for a few brief hours after, they could remember what it felt like to be wanted, not loved, wanted. There is no more honest ache, no deeper lever with which to move a soul. Agnethy's final act came on Candlemas, 1845. A woman from Vienna brought the corpse of her 4-day-old daughter in a basket lined with hymns. She begged for the child to be named. Mother Agnethy accepted. She placed the child in the tub, whispered bled, and at sunrise the baby gasped, not for air, but for memory. Witnesses, all of whom later died in childbirth, claimed the baby spoke, not words, but a name, as if announcing herself to someone waiting behind the veil. Then she died again, this time with her mouth closed. They buried the child in the roots of the chapel. 3 days later, the chapel vanished. No ruins, no foundation, only the dolls scattered in the grass, each now with eyes painted in ash and carved on a tree nearby. All saints are mothers, and all mothers must one day be orphans. Some say Mother Agnethy was never meant to be born, that she was the unfinished prayer of a nun who died in childbirth during a lunar eclipse, that her rituals were not intercessions but corrections, and that the crimson veil preserved her not for her cruelty but for her audacity. She gave the forgotten a name, and for one breathless moment the universe heard them. You've heard of curses, of bloodlines haunted, of ancestral sin passed down like jewelry, tarnished, bitter, unasked for. But what if a family did not flee their curse, but fed it? Let us now speak of the Van Mergelen daughters, 5 sisters, born beneath the blackened rafters of Castle Harsveld, where the river Dean runs redder than it ought, and the crow's nest in chimneys long since cold. A castle once devoted to monastic silence, until silence was pierced by lullabies. The Van Mergelen line traced its blood back to an executioner of orphans, a midwife of plagues, and a nun who allegedly gave birth without conception. Whether true or embroidered, what mattered was this: each generation lost its daughters, always before their 23rd year, always without a trace, always on the night of the first frost. So when the Baroness Claudine Van Mergelen birthed 5 girls in 5 years, the local priest simply whispered, "God help us," and resigned his post. The girls were not raised in nursery or garden, but in the gown room, a long, stone-walled chamber lined with dresses, dozens, hundreds, all child-sized, none worn. Each dress bore a tag with a name and a date, dates which ended in frost. The eldest daughter, Rosalane, asked once where the dresses came from. The Baroness only replied, "You wore them already. You just haven't lived it yet." The girls were fed in silence, tutored in candlelight, and forbidden to touch mirrors. They were never called by their names, only first, second, third, and so on. And when each girl began to bleed for the first time, she was led into the chapel's undercroft, where a silver basin waited. There, her blood was not wiped or hidden. It was measured. The ritual was called the accounting, a weighing of the inner frost, the chill that determined how soon she would vanish. Not all blood is warm, you see. Not all girls belong to the present. Rosalaine's blood was said to be nearly black. The governess smiled. You will be a bride of winter. And so the girls prepared not for weddings, nor love, nor future, but for their departure, until the fourth daughter, Elfrida, rebelled. She stole into the west wing and found the forbidden gallery. There, beneath drapes of dust, were 5 portraits, each of a girl in white, each identical, and each marked only by a title: the first cry, the last cradle, the bride between worlds, the mirror of the frosted veil, the one who did not sleep. All bore her face, not similar, hers. Elfrida screamed. The echo cracked the hallway mirror, and for the first time in the castle's history, a girl survived the first frost, but only partially. She stopped speaking, stopped eating. Her hair turned white within a week. She did not die, but she did not continue living either. She became what the maids called the waiting child. She sat in the gown room, unmoving, wearing a dress too small for her, a dress with no name tag, because she had stepped out of the script. The Baroness wept once, then ordered a new ritual, the binding of the names. The remaining daughters were sewn into their dresses. Literally, threads passed through flesh at the shoulders and collar, tethering skin to satin. If they will not enter their fate willingly, she said, then we will tie them to it. But something was unraveling, because Rosalaine the first, the black-blooded, began to dream backward. She spoke in tongues never taught, recounted memories of girls who had never lived, described in terrifying detail the drowning of a child who'd never seen water. The dreams became sermons, her words not her own. And one night she simply stood, eyes glazed, hands bleeding from the stitches, and declared, "The dresses are not to clothe the dead, they are to remember the dying." Then she vanished. No footsteps, no scream, only a puddle of melting frost in her place. The governess hung her dress on the wall. One more tagged gown, one more name. Today, Castle Harsfeld stands empty. Locals avoid the woods, but some say the gown room still holds 6 dresses, not 5, 6, and no one knows who the 6th belongs to. But sometimes, in the dark before the first frost, travelers hear, humming from the chimney stacks, a lullaby no one remembers learning, and in the still air of early snow, a whisper, "I wore the dress, now the dress wears me." There are places in this world that do not appear on maps because they do not move with time. They are tethered, not to soil, but to memory. One such place was St. Épine's foundling house, a convent turned orphanage, turned something else entirely. Located somewhere near the border of Alsace and Lorraine, its stones were so old they seemed made of compressed fog and regret. The locals called it La Maison des Petites Lunes, the House of Little Moons, because the girls there were only allowed outside at night, always under the veil of a full moon, as if daylight might spoil them or reveal too much. It was managed by Reverend Mother, a figure of such obscurity that no birth records, no baptismal certificate, no convent registry could confirm she ever existed. Yet she was there, always there, white-eyed, silent, her mouth trembling constantly, as though reciting prayers not meant for the living. Saint Épine did not take in unwanted children. It took in forgotten ones. Girls who had been erased from census rolls. Children born in secret or too soon. Girls whose names were written only once and then burned. Their arrival was always the same, left on the gate in velvet-trapped silence, with an object tied to them, not a toy, but a fragment, a page torn from a hymnal, a finger bone carved with runes, a lock of hair sealed in wax. These were not children. These were keys. You see, Reverend Mother believed in what she called the doctrine of reverse baptism. She preached, though never allowed, that all souls begin complete, and that birth is a wound, a tearing from something sacred. So the goal of her work was not salvation. It was reassembling. The girls at St. Épine were not raised. They were rewritten. Each morning they were taught a new name, a new past. Some were told they had drowned. Others were told they had died in childbirth. By dusk, the lesson changed. No name lasted more than a day. One survivor recalled being called Amaryllis in the morning and the mistake by evening. Another girl was never given a name, only a sequence of numbers, which changed hourly. But the strangest of the practices was the veiling room. Each girl, once she began to bleed, was led alone into a circular chamber lined with drapes. The floor was covered in white ash. At the center stood a glass basin filled with water, ink, and a thin layer of blood. There she was told to choose a curtain. Behind it, a life she had never lived and must now inhabit. Some girls returned smiling, most returned weeping. All returned changed, because whatever lay behind those curtains, it stayed with them. The walls of St. Épine were said to whisper in dozens of voices at once, all in the same tone, a low croon, like a cradle rocked by wind. One orphan wrote, in a letter that somehow survived the fire, "We are not many girls. We are one girl, scattered across many faces, and she remembers. She always remembers." S. greatest creation, her masterpiece, was a ritual known as the recitation of the Unborn. Once a year, on the winter solstice, the girls gathered in the central courtyard, each wearing a blank mask. They formed a circle. Candles were placed at their feet, and a red thread was tied from tongue to tongue, passing through slits in each mask. They then took turns speaking, but they did not speak their own thoughts. They spoke in voices that were not theirs, as if channeling the biographies of girls who never existed. Some described villages no map could confirm. Others recalled deaths that hadn't happened. One girl, no older than 10, described in perfect detail the sensation of being buried alive, whispering, "I was the first. I am the last. You stitched me together with other people's silence." Then she bled from her ears and vanished the next morning, her bed untouched, the thread still red. The convent was burned to the ground in 1852, allegedly by a passing priest who claimed he had smelled memory decaying. All records of its existence were destroyed, but in the ruins, scorched into the chapel wall, was a phrase no fire could erase. These were not girls. These were what happens when names are broken. And so the crimson veil endured, not only through blood or bell or bridal lace, but through the unmaking of identity itself. Because to them, a girl was not a person. She was a vessel, and vessels, once emptied of their name, can be filled with anything. To most, the industrial age meant steam and steel, coal and conquest. But beneath the soot-streaked world of gears and gaslight, something more delicate and more terrible was unfolding. Something called the Aster cabinet. Founded in 1856 by Countess Isadora van Helmrich, a widow twice over, and a patroness of forgotten crafts. The Aster cabinet was not a salon nor a gallery. It was a private archive, a reliquary of lives that had never been lived, and it specialized in a single obsession: preserving unreal girlhoods. The cabinet's headquarters was a 4-story townhouse in Dresden, lined inside with velvet-lined drawers, vitrines, and memory boxes stacked to the ceiling. Not a single item was labeled. Not one was explained. You had to be invited. You had to know what you had lost. What did the cabinet contain? A diary, written entirely in future tense. A doll with a spine made of bird bones and teeth sewn into its palms. A pair of shoes made from skin that seemed to flinch when touched. Dozens of letters addressed to girls who had never been born, each reply folded neatly inside, already opened. But the true focus of the cabinet was the girls themselves, not in body, but in echo. For Van Helmrich had developed a technique she called memory weaving. She claimed that if one could collect enough personal artifacts tied to a hypothetical life, a hair ribbon, a school book, a broken comb, one could stitch a memory of that life into being. And if that memory was strong enough, it would find a body. To her followers, mostly widows, barren women, aging noblewomen, who had once lost a sister, or a twin, or a child at sea, the Aster cabinet offered something far more dangerous than hope. It offered substitution. The women who joined were called Mothers of the Veil, and each was assigned an archivist, a girl from the slums. Orphanages or debtor prisons brought in under false pretense and renamed after a lost ideal. Modesty, temperance, Petravera, not real names, just assignments. Each girl was locked in a velvet chamber for 33 days, surrounded by the artifacts of a life she never lived. She was forbidden from speaking her real name. She was read bedtime stories that ended mid-sentence. She was fed only white foods, and when she began to weep in confusion, she was told, "You're almost home, darling. You just have to forget what you remember." Some girls fought, some went silent, some began to correct the archive, insisting details were wrong, that they had never liked peppermint, that the room had once had lilacs, and when they began to dream as if the memories were their own, that's when the cabinet considered them complete. These were called mirrored daughters. They were not adopted. They were unveiled, presented to the mother in a final ritual known as the welcoming. In the candlelit chamber, the archivist would kneel before her assigned mother, who would gently place a brooch, always made from hair and ash, at the girl's throat and whisper, "You were always mine. I just forgot how to find you." Witnesses said the girls smiled. Some fainted, some wept, and a few simply turned to dust the moment the brooch touched their skin. Because, you see, memory, when built from grief, is volatile. It either binds or burns. By 1864, the Aster cabinet had catalogued 214 mirrored daughters. None survived past their 13th month. They did not die violently. They simply began to fade. First, their shadows grew faint. Then their reflections lagged. Then their names could no longer be remembered, even by the mothers who had created them. And then they disappeared, one by one, until all that remained was the brooch and the box of artifacts, with a new item added, a fingernail, a tear-stained thread, a page from a book that does not exist. Van Helmrich vanished in 1866. Her townhouse was emptied within days, without any official decree. But a visitor to the ruins claimed she found, in the ash-choked basement, a single velvet box, labeled only. She almost was, and, inside, a note. When memory becomes more beloved than the girl, you do not resurrect her. You replace her. To the crimson veil, the Aster cabinet marked a new chapter, a refinement. Why stain your hands with blood, after all, when you can simply forget the real child and build a quieter one from grief? Not every chapter in the Crimson Veil's history was written in shadow. Some were performed in broad daylight for all the world to admire, and none to truly understand. And at the heart of one such chapter stood the strange and sorrowful woman known only as Madame Day, founder of the Institution for the Advancement of Orphaned Expression, also called La Chanterelle des Silences. Established in 1871 near Lake Geneva, the institution was described by one visitor as a ballet school sewn shut with grief. It was neither an orphanage nor a conservatoire. It was a stage of mourning, built on the belief that certain girls, particularly those abandoned or erased, a resonance that, if properly cultivated, could reproduce the gestures of lost ancestors, did not teach dance. She taught echo pantomime, a bizarre, exacting form of silent performance said to trigger intergenerational memory. Recall, her pupils were all girls under the age of 12, selected through a process she called blood listening. A girl would place her palm over a vibrating stone and, if her heartbeat matched the tempo of the buried grief beneath it, she was admitted. Inside, the school followed no normal rhythms. Classes were held between midnight and dawn. Meals were eaten without chewing. The girls wore thin muslin gowns and no shoes. They were forbidden to speak their birth names, forbidden to sleep in the same bed twice, and forbidden, above all, to ever ask why they were there. Because, according to Madame, the moment a girl questions her sorrow, it forgets how to perform. Instead, the girls were taught to move, but not freely. Each gesture had to replicate a residue of loss. A mother folding a dress that no longer fits. A sister waving goodbye to someone who never left. A hand that reaches for a lock of hair and finds it missing. Movements that were never meant for applause, only for remembering. The school's showcase performances were never advertised, and yet were always full. Women of stature would arrive in black gowns, hands gloved, lips bloodless with anticipation. They watched in silence as rows of orphan girls mimed invisible tragedies across a reclined stage. Cradles crumbling into dust, birthday candles blown out by no one, invisible hands brushing empty cheeks, and the audience would weep, not out of pity, but out of a kind of nostalgia for griefs they had never owned. Because the girls were not miming their own sorrows. They were reenacting the losses of others. Each movement a borrowed mourning, each tear a surrogate. It was said that after a particularly devastating performance in 1875, the girl who stood still until her family forgot her. 6 women in the audience collapsed. One was later found humming in a nursery she had never seen before. Another began speaking in a dialect not spoken for 300 years. The third simply walked into the lake and never returned. That same year, introduced her most controversial invention, the reverse stage, a mirror-backed chamber in which the audience sat behind the glass, and the girls, veiled and silent, performed without knowing who watched. This, she claimed, created a perfect sorrow loop. The grief of the observer fed the child's performance, which in turn deepened the observer's loss, until the line between audience and actor blurred entirely. At the final performance of the reverse stage, the girl playing the abandoned twin began to scream, not with sound, but with her body. Her limbs twisted, her face contorted in gestures not taught, movements primal, ancient. She danced a death that was not hers. The glass of the reverse stage cracked from within. The audience fled, and Madame closed the school the next morning. All the girls were sent away, but not to homes. 2 places called reflection sanctuaries, run by nameless matrons in cities that no longer exist. Herself vanished. Her portrait remains, however, a blurred daguerreotype, showing a pale woman with her hands held over her mouth, as if trying to hold back a name she had once heard whispered inside her own womb. Some say the school was funded by members of the Crimson Veil. Some say it was the Crimson Veil, recloaked in art, because what is grief, really, if not a performance? And what is a child's body, if not the stage upon which we rehearse our deepest regrets? There is a name that appears again and again in the forbidden footnotes of the 19th century, never as a headline, never in bold, only in marginalia, in the ash between sentences. That name is Dr. de Morel, and she is perhaps the closest thing the Crimson Veil ever had to a scientist. But she did not study the body. She studied the soul's architecture and how it decayed. She called her practice thanatometrics, the measurement of spiritual entropy in abandoned children. Her clinic was not registered with any university or medical board. It had no sign, only a red window pane on a quiet street in Bruges, where the air smelled of chalk and tinctures and sleep. Inside, no patients were admitted, only specimens, always girls, always aged 7 to 12, always untraceable. Each was kept in a separate room, not locked, but titled. The rooms bore names like the Chamber of Unshed Tears, the Corridor of Last Words, the Nursery Without Time, and each was rigged with devices designed not to restrain, but to observe despair as it mutated. She used mirrors with reversed curvature, which distorted the child's reflection until it no longer resembled a face. She served meals that looked like comfort food, but tasted of nothing. She played lullabies backwards, so the melodies unraveled like spoiled thread. But her masterpiece was what she called the cage of pronouns. Inside this chamber, the child would be read stories, rewritten to remove all sense of identity. No names, no genders, no first-person narration. Just events, detached, clinical. Over time, the girls would begin to refer to themselves not as I, but as it. And when they stopped responding to any name, even their own, she considered them ready. Ready for what? For the infusion ritual. For you see, Dr. de Morel believed that when a soul is sufficiently eroded, when its shape has collapsed inward from neglect, it becomes porous, and in that void, she believed, one could pour the memory of another girl, one who had died in terror, one who had been forgotten. Memory is the soul's shadow, she wrote, and if you bend the light just so, the shadow will fall on a new wall. To this end, she collected the relics of dead orphans, teeth, fingernails, blood-soaked dolls, unsent letters. Each was wrapped in wax paper and paired with a child whose spirit had gone dim. She would place the relic beneath the child's pillow and whisper, "Let what was lost now return. You are not a girl, you are a ghost that learned to keep breathing." Some children convulsed, some vomited, some spoke in voices they had never heard, recounting deaths that predated their birth. One girl carved a name into her thigh, a name that belonged to a child buried in 1783 beneath a church that no longer stood. Another refused to speak for 40 days, then suddenly sang a nursery rhyme in Hungarian. Her parents had been French. She had never left Belgium. But the most disturbing effect was the echo skin, a term coined by de Morel for the phenomenon where a child's flesh began to show scars, bruises, or birthmarks that corresponded with the relic's original owner. The body remembered what the soul had forgotten, and sometimes the memory was stronger than the flesh. A girl named was given a ribbon from a child who drowned in a copper washtub. Within hours, her lungs began to fill with fluid. There was no infection, only remembrance. Dr. Demerel's notes claim she succeeded in 17 cases. What success meant, she never clarified. But in one cryptic entry, she writes, "She looked at me with someone else's sorrow, and I wept as though she were my daughter. Though I have never borne a child, I simply remembered doing so." Her clinic burned in 1881. All that remained was a wall of chart drawers, each labeled with a girl's name, each containing no paper, only dust. But carved into the stone hearth was a final line: "We have found a way to raise the dead, but only as echoes, and echoes cannot be embraced, only listened to until they fade." The crimson veil preserved her legacy, not in body or doctrine, but in methodology, for they had discovered a terrible truth. It is not blood that grants power over the innocent. It is remembrance, and when you make a child forget who she is, she will become whatever you mourn most. By the final years of the 19th century, the crimson veil had ceased to be a rumor whispered behind lace fans and confessionals. It had become something larger, something more ambient, a sorrow stitched into the fabric of aristocratic womanhood. A doctrine whispered not from pulpits, but from mothers to daughters, governesses to wards, widows to childless friends who could not sleep. And perhaps the most disturbing proof of its persistence came in the form of the Silent Nursery, hosted annually by Lady Thaleia Moorcroft, the last true Baroness of Duringfield Hall. She was not a monster, not in the old-fashioned sense. She threw garden parties, donated to hospitals, funded schools for girls. But her home, her real home, was not the hall itself. It was the attic chapel, a space none of the servants would enter after sunset. The chapel contained no crucifix, no pews, only mirrors, dozens of them, all arranged so that no reflection ever showed the same person twice. And at its center, a child's cradle made of salt-stained oak, its mattress yellowed with age, covered by a lace shroud that no one had ever dared lift. Lady Thaleia had once borne a daughter. The story went, a single child, stillborn. Yet each year, on the night of the girl's would-be birthday, she hosted a but not with mediums, with performers. Each woman invited. The rules were strict. No photographs, no names spoken aloud, no tears until the third bell. Once seated, you could not look away from your own reflection until instructed. And the most important rule: do not ask who the other women are. They wore veils. They were addressed only as the morning. The ritual began with silence, not imposed, but absorbed, as though the room itself drank sound. Then came the tapping, not of fingers, but of small feet, echoing across the floorboards above. There were no rooms above. Then the mirrors would begin to hum, not audibly, but at the edge of perception, like a violin string vibrating in your teeth. Reflections began to blur, then shift, showing images that belonged to no one present. A girl brushing the hair of a corpse. A child locked in a wardrobe, whispering to her own bones. A nursery flooded in moonlight, the cradles rocking on their own. Then Lady Thaleia would speak, never louder than a breath. "Do you remember her?" she would ask. And each woman was expected to answer, not with words, but with movement, a gesture from the child she had lost, a way of brushing the hair, a dance step, a cough, a twitch. The body summoned the memory more truly than the mouth ever could. And then the cradle in the center would begin to shift, not rock, but breathe, as if something beneath the lace was exhaling. Lady Thaleia would approach, she would kneel, and she would listen. She called it the unnaming, for the crimson veil had learned by now that what gave a child its power was not identity, but grief unspoken. And if you could reverse the act of naming, peel it back like skin, you could offer the child not rest, but usefulness. At the climax, each guest would place their offering into the cradle, a hairclip, a pacifier, a tooth. They did not stay, they sank, and in the morning the cradle would be empty again, or so it appeared, because the guests, once returned to their manors, their houses, their estates, began to change. Some awoke with songs in their throats they had never heard before. Some wept when touching water, and some, very quietly, began adopting girls from orphanages no one had approved. Girls who answered to no name, yet claimed to have been waiting in the mirrors. Lady Thaleia died in 1901, or so her obituary claimed. Her body was never buried. The cradle was sealed inside a reliquary of stone and lead, and the attic was locked. But on nights when the wind howls through the hallways of Durringfield, now a government facility, staff swear they can hear a rattle, not a ghost, not a spirit. A rattle, wooden, hollow, and the faint sound of mirrors exhaling. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe's noble houses had begun to crumble, not with gunpowder or revolution, but with forgetting. Lineages thinned, manors shuttered, portraits sold off, their eyes scratched out by time. The age of the veil, it seemed, had passed, but the women knew better. They always do. And in 1913, in the Alpine borderland between France and Italy, they gathered for the last official ceremony of the Crimson Veil. They called it the Confluence of the Hollow Brides. There was no cathedral, no stage, only a glacial hollow, a place with no official name, known only to those whose grief had nowhere else to be kept. The invitation was a single line, handwritten in rust-brown ink. "Bring her with you, the one you almost had," and they came, not in carriages, not in processions, but alone, on foot, veiled, each carrying an empty dress, some silk, some wool, some no more than cotton threadbare, from being folded, unfolded, and wept into 4 decades. There were over 80 women, no men, no clergy, only silence, as they stood around a silver basin embedded in the earth, half filled with black water. A single woman presided, her name lost, her face never recorded. Only the title remains, the midwife of the last remembrance. She wore no veil, only a shroud of mourning tape wrapped around her throat, as though something had once been spoken there and punished. The ritual had no formal structure. Each woman approached the basin when she felt called. She would take her dress, the one meant for the daughter who never was, and dip it into the water, and then speak, not a name, not a prayer, but a description of the absence. She was to have had my grandmother's eyes. I felt her kick once, and never again. She was born in winter and left before the thaw. I never held her, but I still wake up smelling her hair. And each dress, upon being submerged, would not become wet. It would become heavy, as if something inside had remembered how to breathe. Some women could not let go. They clung to the cloth, sobbing, screaming, refusing to drop the bundle. Those women were led away, not by force, but by others who had already completed the rite. Women who understood what it meant to carry grief that had become too familiar to bury. And when all had given their dresses, the midwife stepped forward. She did not speak. She only opened her hands, and from within them, salt. She poured it into the basin. The water hissed, the dresses sank, and a fog rose. But not a fog of air or cold. A fog of names, unspoken. It twisted between the women, brushing their veils, whispering in languages they'd never learned, but somehow understood. Words like motherlsborn, uncarried, she was and she wasn't. And one by one, the women began to hum, not a song, a memory, of lullabies never sung, of cribs never rocked, of a voice they imagined they might have had the girl lived long enough to hear it. The midwife then turned, knelt by the basin, and whispered, "We do not ask for them back. We ask only to remember without pain." And for the first time, perhaps the only time in the entire history of the Crimson Veil, there was no blood, no orphans, no relics, no stolen names, only grief, laid bare, seen, and then slowly released. At sunrise, the hollow was empty, the basin gone. Only a scattering of salt remained, and the faintest outline in the frost, the shape of a cradle. Many scholars have dismissed the confluence as fiction, a metaphor, a delusion of noblewomen, unhinged by loss. But in 1982, a hiking expedition in the region reported a strange sight in a mountain grove. They found 81 stones, each marked with a symbol of a girl, a braid, a shoe, a tiny handprint, and beneath each, buried in moss, a bundle of cloth, child-sized, never worn, and no one has dared move them. They say history is written by the victors, but this story was never written, only whispered, sewn into hymns, pressed between pages of hymnals, no longer read, encoded into lullabies, sung in keys no mother remembers learning. The crimson veil is gone. That is what the record tells us. That the noble women who fed on grief, who shaped silence into sacrament, their halls abandoned, their rituals lost, their archives burned, or buried, or dismissed as myth. And yet, there is a house in Vienna, a narrow one, 3 windows wide. A seamstress lives there, old as bone, with no apprentice, no ledger, no hours of operation. But once a year, on the winter solstice, a girl is seen entering alone, carrying only a folded garment. She leaves without it, and inside the shop's sealed attic, if one were to pry open the nailed door, they would find not bolts of cloth, not mannequins, not thread, but cradles, dozens of them, empty, save for a single item in each, a button, a braid, a photograph with the child's face cut out. There is a clinic. In it no longer appears on maps. But sometimes a midwife arrives, muttering in Latin, asking for a vial of vitrum silenti, the glass of silence. She pays in coins older than the Republic, and always leaves a question behind. Has she arrived yet? The one who remembers before she breathes. There is a church in Lisbon, boarded shut for 80 years. Yet every Sunday morning, a candle appears in the apse, lit, warm, unsmelled by any passing wind. And beside it, a girl's shoe, smaller than any child should wear, embroidered with a name that changes weekly. The letters always blur before they can be read. And most of all, there are the women, the ones who do not speak of daughters, who set extra places at empty tables, who linger outside nurseries with no child within. They are not witches, they are not murderers, they are simply vessels that never emptied. They know better than to speak the name of the crimson veil, but they remember the signs, a mirror that won't hold your reflection for more than a second, a lullaby that ends with a note that makes you cry without knowing why, a dream where you are brushing a child's hair and you wake up holding a strand. You ask, was any of it true? But you already know how this works. Truth in these stories is not a matter of evidence, it's a matter of resonance. Does it tremble inside you? Do you feel something move, slow and cold, beneath the ribs, as though some part of you has been waiting for this story your entire life? If so, then perhaps the cult never needed blood, not truly. Perhaps all it ever needed was memory and grief and a girl left in a cradle, in a drawer, in the hollow of your heart, never named, never held, but never gone. And tonight, as the frost gathers on your window and the world slips back into its oldest silence, listen closely. Do you hear the cradle creak? Do you hear her breathing? Do not turn around. She was always here. She just needed someone to remember. And now, you do.